So yeah.
Yeah, so I was doing some reading this week, and while we always were reading like sci-fi and fantasy as a group, but we all read lots of other things too. And I came across some annals from the 11th and 12th century.
Some annals?
Annals.
Oh, annals. Okay.
Annals. Like Annals of the Kings kind of
stuff. He's grinning, though. This is about to take a turn.
Okay. An anal turn.
Yeah, but so according to several reports, one from the 11th century and one from the 12th,
all right.
Beavers were known to enslave other beavers.
We're talking about the critter.
The critter, the animal.
Okay. Yep.
But
the dam building, the little furry animal.
All right.
Basically, there was an Arab traveler and polymath named Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who was living among the Khazars, who wrote that he was like, it's known among these people that beavers enslave other beavers. This comes up again in the Historia Norwegia, which is the oldest surviving text that we have from Norway, or one of.
Okay.
They also talk a lot about how, like, beavers... It talks about beavers, and they're like, yes, and we all know that beavers enslave other beavers.
We all know.
We all know that slavery is common among beavers. With the thought being, but what interestingly, this ends up going into the Americas, and there's some like indigenous American stories about this too. But these are older as far as like our records of them. But the story being that beavers, in the year once they're old enough to mate, they leave the nest, and if they don't find a mate,
the dam, right?
Yeah, well, the den,
the family den,
the family den. They leave to go find a mate. If they don't find a mate, they return home, and supposedly in the first year, when they return home, they're allowed to return and they're like part of the family again. But then they go out again, and if they don't find a mate and they come back, the beavers are like, no, you're on your own. And at that point, the mateless beaver will then eventually be like enslaved by other rogue beavers. And this is supposedly but then the way they said they know this is that two things would happen: is they would build the multi-level dens, and what they would do when there were predators nearby, they would put the slave beavers at the mouth of the den to be like
feed the dragon.
Yes, one. And then two,
they're virgins.
Among the Khazars,
feed the virgin beaver.
Yes, among the Khazars, they said that you could tell the slave beavers from the king master beavers by the quality of their pelts, because they made the slave beavers do all the work, so their pelts were all mottled and nasty, because they would make them do all the chewing,
all the beaver work, all so that beaver work.
You didn't want to buy a slave beaver pelt because it would be all like destroyed.
Okay, is there? I don't mean to cast any aspersions against 11th century historians and scientists and biologists, but do we have any modern
slave beavers?
Any modern
so my research stops during this time period, so I can't comment on whether or not whether it's continued. But I would be worried that because of woke
Okay, part two of my question.
Okay. Hashtag me too and the beavers.
Part two of my question here. What were Mr. and Mrs. Beaver up to in Narnia?
So that's the thing, is what we don't know is there was a whole cast of beavers in the back.
Yeah.
That's what we don't see, but that's the horrors of the beaver world. Or the realities of it, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't want to cast aspersions on their society.
I mean, from that point of view, the White Witch was doing everyone a solid with the beaver lockdown.
We don't know how she was involved in this potentially.
Interestingly, though, in Canada, it's actually known, and actually, often other animals will live in beaver dens than beavers.
Right.
There's like, I don't know the full list, but supposedly there's like 11 other animals that will live in a beaver den.
Let's think, just offhand, like anteaters. They would go there.
Anteaters, of course,
giraffes, rhinos.
Those.
But a bunch of complicit animals.
Yeah,
complicit animals.
Yeah, very docile.
But in the 1920s in Canada, back up slightly. Muskrats are one of the animals that'll live in a beaver den. But it was supposedly known, and they said that there were trappers and things that would, like, in the 1920s, who were like, oh yeah, everybody knows the beavers enslave muskrats to live with them and do their also menial work. So that was another, but it was like an interspecies slavery. but then they said we confirmed it with the natives and that the beavers enslaved the muskrats.
Oh, so they're talking to the natives like, hey guys, they're like, we want your land, but first off, just tell me about like the animal, like sort of. Is there like a hierarchy? They're like, yes. Honestly, on the tip of my tongue, I was gonna say that the beavers enslaved muskrats as well as virgin beavers.
Oh my God! Well,
but interestingly, this is one interesting. This one I do have a modern comment on, where actually modern research has determined that it's actually the muskrats that are exploiting the beavers, using their resources and pestering them. And the beavers sort of like half tolerate them, but it's actually the muskrats are like totally leeching off the beavers. It's actually they had it totally backwards.
We're seeing evolutionary how a symbiotic relationship can ultimately become
exploitive. Yes,
now they're codependent. Like they should go to therapy.
There's a lot to learn here.
What nature is incredible. This was not where I thought this conversation was gonna go.
Yeah.
I mean, what's next? Towers.
What's next? What's after muskrat?
We don't know.
Oh, my God. I'm Steven.
I'm Daniel.
I'm Sam.
And this is the Under Towers podcast. And Michael Vannon, all that good stuff. Yeah, that threw me for a fucking loop.
Well, we've been reading the Mabinogions from like 11th century, sort of.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's
I mean,
great.
this is kind of like a red wall, like, dystopian sort of thing.
There's the grimdark red wall.
There you go.
Slaver beavers.
All right, so tonight we don't really have much news. While we're recording this, Readings of Power Season 2 is dropping.
Yep.
Well, episode 1 and 2
and 3
and 3.
Yeah, it's a few episodes at a time. So
how nice of them.
So we'll be watching that and we'll be reporting back. But for tonight,
well, we can announce we have a special guest next week.
We do, yeah. Next week. So podcast news. Next week, we will be doing a joint episode with the Rereading Wolf podcast,
and
where
James
we will
Wynn,
be talking about Wizard Knight with Mr. James Wynn from, again, the Rereading Wolf podcast. Super stoked about that. So tune in next week if you've read the book, because it's going to be a spoiler-heavy discussion. But for tonight, we are going to be discussing Berserk. But before we discuss Berserk, a word from our sponsors.
Are you going gray? Feeling like it's time for something new? Have you met your match in life, leading you to a dead end, cast astray across the eons of space and time until you yearn for the white shores and the sound of silver trumpets calling you home? Then White Wizard Makeover and Blowout Bar is is ready for you to give them a call. They will turn both your gray drab looks and locks into shining white beacons of hope and love, rekindling the fires of passion as you fulfill all of life's many and numerous quests. When everyone else is going multicolored, it's time for blinding white. Turn great Grandolph into vivacious Glamdolph. Turn to White Wizard Makeover and Blowout Bar. White Wizard Makeover and Blowout Bar today at the turning of the tide.
And
at
as
the
always,
turn of the tide.
Code Undertowers for 10% off your first Wizard Makeover.
Yes, we wanted to say they only do straightening. They want me to caveat that they only do hair straightening.
They're like flooded
no
with
curly
requests,
hair, or no making of the hair curly.
Right. It is a very one track shop, but you know what? They
do great.
They have their
work.
lane and they do it amazingly. And
they
do. The grays are starting to fill in here, so I might be paying them a visit. But
yeah, you come back with ambiguous extra powers too.
Yes.
Man, you're knocking it out of the park tonight. All right. So on to our main topic of conversation. Tonight we are having kind of an open discussion of Kentaro Miura's epic manga, Berserk.
Rest in peace.
R.I.P. We are going to be as spoiler-free as possible here at the beginning. And if we start feeling the need to delve into spoilery territories, we will say so before we get there. So I believe in 89 was when this series started, so it's as old as us.
Yes. There was like a proto chapter.
Right. That I think he did in college or something.
Yeah, they came out a few years before that.
And that's included in one of these Dark Horse editions.
Yes.
I want to say 3 or 4.
I was going to say 5.
It might be 5. I don't remember exactly, but if you're at all familiar with the world of manga, anime, you have at the very least heard Berserk. It is far and away one of the most influential works of fantasy fiction ever written. You don't have even if you're not reading manga or comic books of any sort, if you like From Software games, Dark Souls, Elden Ring, Bloodborne, none of those exist without Berserk. It's wildly influential, and I had heard about it for years, just by existing and being a fantasy fan. I will admit I was not a manga person at the time, but I'd heard amazing things. It was always on my radar. It was always something that I kind of wanted to read, but I was intimidated by the length and the price point of getting into it. Just all these things were kind of stopping me from diving in. For me personally, a little bit before we started our book club, a couple months before that, Berserk kind of came into the booktube space, and a bunch of booktubers that I was following at the time, all kind of started reading it at the same moment, and it really got me thinking. And I'm like, man, I need to start reading this, and then when we started talking about our book club, I thought this was kind of the moment to start. We got together to watch Akira for the first time together. We obviously, as we've discussed previously, we grew up watching DBZ and Gundam and all these animes together, and so it seemed like the perfect fit. And before I start diving into how I feel about Berserk now, what was your guys before we started reading them? What was your familiarity with Berserk, the series, before we started?
Yeah, I think for me, I kind of want to caveat the idea of what Berserk is, aside from manga, just like the idea of Berserk, and we've seen in other stuff we've read, like Berserk and stuff. It's like that fighting that people have that is not necessarily skilled, but so scary or enraged that it has an extra special ability attached to whatever skill the possessor might have that gives them kind of a one-up on everyone. It reminds me of when we were kids and played touch football. And one time I remember we were playing against you, and you're a little bit older than me, and I was on the team of younger guys. And then I rallied the guys, and I'm like, let's just go crazy on them. And then I remember charging the field for a two-hand touch, and you guys kind of cowered a little because we were so enraged at we are smaller than you, but we are gonna fight till it's over. And I think we won that play, and not the game, but just that play.
Just that one play.
Yeah, because I think we went a little bit berserk in the moment.
Wow,
good for you.
I think that's a good moment. You don't remember that?
I remember it. I remember
that one.
I remember it. It was in my neighborhood. Yeah. In the middle of the.
We went berserk, bro.
I remember.
It's apparently scarred me so much apparently that I've scrubbed that from my memory bank.
We need to get it. But that's kind of I think that idea is so well presented in this, in terms of it's almost like an intrinsic value that Guts has as a character. It also kind of is the name of the story, and kind of something that comes maybe later to him. But that's kind of where my entry into this is. I was going into reading Berserk all right, when am I going to see that ideal kind of presented in this
pretty quickly, as it turns out.
Yeah, as it turns out. Interestingly, it's almost in the first page. Yeah.
Interestingly, though, to that, the name Berserk isn't mentioned, I don't think, until volume 8 or 9.
Yeah, maybe 10.
And then there's a moment where there's a thing that relates to.
And it should be noted real quick, when we say numbers of volumes, we're talking about these big
Dark Horse volumes,
not volumes, not the individual.
So I should say, deluxe volume. Deluxe volume.
I don't. That would be like 30 or something like that.
I honestly don't remember.
I think there's 3 per. So it would be like 27.
It happens at some point.
Yeah.
But I had heard of Berserk. I had never read a manga before. I had seen people talk about it. I recently had started watching more anime again, and so I was actually wanting something else to watch after watching what I just watched was Hunter x Hunter, and then Neon Genesis Evangelion, and then Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and was looking for something to watch. Someone had talked about Berserk, and I remember had a conversation. They were like, I was like, should I watch the anime? And they were like, anime's all right. The manga is literally like incredible. You should. And this was only a few months before we read it. Mm-hmm. And so I was like, I didn't have an easy way. Well, if I had found an easy way to read it, I might have been interested, but I wasn't going to invest in all this. But obviously doing this as a group. But I was happy for that interaction because I probably would have been down anyways. But it definitely was like, I was like, oh, I've heard this is very good. So cool.
Yeah.
It definitely added to it. But that was really all I knew about it. I knew it was fantasy, and didn't really know anything more than that. And I don't think I'd actually really watched until we read this a fantasy anime. Obviously, lots of them have fantasy elements,
right?
But not a medieval setting or tons of swords, unless I'm forgetting something. But if it did, it still was something zanier with mechas and stuff or something. But no, it just pretty immediately blew me away. And it really is just fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I spoiler alert, I fell absolutely head over heels in love with it. I had read one manga before Berserk, and that was just Uzumaki, which is, a 1-book horror manga by Junji Ito, and it's phenomenal. And you can see looking back on it, you can see some very heavy influence from Berserk on Junji Ito's work in that book. But that was my only familiarity. Obviously, like we've discussed prior, read a lot of comic books growing up, Western comic books. I'd never read anything like Berserk. Berserk to me is kind of up there. The only other thing I can think of in kind of the comic realm is Watchmen, as far as this is something that transcends the medium, and it's no longer just a comic book or a manga, but this is a piece of literature.
Sure.
And frankly, it is, all told, it is one of the greatest works of fantasy literature that I have ever read, period.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. It's the story of Guts, this warrior who has had one of the most traumatic lives, literally from his birth, that you can imagine. Gone from mercenary troop to mercenary troop. And because of all of these wounds that he suffered, he's completely closed off to human interaction. And kind of one of the beautiful things about Berserk is it's called Berserk. It's about this warrior. It's one of the most violent and gory things I've ever read. But at its heart, it is about family and relationships with other people, and the beauty and healing and love that can come from opening yourself up and letting yourself become close with other people and protecting other people instead of just destroying everything that comes in front of you to protect yourself.
Yep.
I have never seen rage and violence drawn the way that Kentaro Miura drew it. It is some of the most visceral art that I have ever seen. And one thing, we've only just started Attack on Titan. There's amazing art in Attack on Titan and amazing action that takes place in Attack on Titan. One thing I will say, and Kentaro Miura was just a genius and a true one-of-a-kind artist. I never really found myself that confused about the action that was happening in Berserk. I don't think I ever had a moment of like really trying to look at a panel and figure out like what is happening here. Like I am with something like Attack on Titan. And maybe that's purposeful because the action is completely different and much more frenetic and high speed, flying around. But
sure.
Anyways, just all that just to say, like one of the things that struck me first about reading Berserk and that kept going and kept escalating as we were reading, only ever really got better, was the art is just phenomenal. It's not always beautiful in like a nice way, but it's always beautiful.
Yeah. No, the art's very, very, very well done. And the designs, the execution of the art is clearly very skilled and evocative, but the overall vibe and the like, I'm sure the aesthetic of the art is what I'm getting at here. The art would still be good if it was actually drawn with less skill, as long as the basic things were getting by. And then obviously you add the skill into it, and it's really well done because there's just really interesting ideas, and the way Guts' armor looks, obviously just the size of his sword.
Yeah.
That grows, shrinks and grows, I guess, throughout the story. But then also you got the little Puck, who's introduced very early on, the little kind of elf figure. Even his design is interesting, and then obviously there's lots of different monsters and stuff, and they're all interesting. And then he really like taps into some incredible sort of eldritch horror in different moments with like, and then there's just gobs and scores of little like demoniac monsters with just like eyes popping out of whichever, and like a face in their stomach, and just it's off-putting. Even when it's like not that gross, it manages to be off-putting in a way that like really,
that's a great way to put
it taps into something. And to me it captures the moment where like I'm not a huge horror fan. I appreciate really well done horror films, but I really don't in general enjoy, I guess slasher is different, but like gore stuff. And it's not even that things like gross me out of those. I mean, usually a lot of the gore stuff does, but a lot of it, especially when it's just kind of gratuitous or whatever, I just like, okay, like I get some people just kind of enjoy this, but I don't find much enjoyment in that personally. Berserk never feels that way.
No.
Even though there's a lot of darkness and intensity in it. There is a purpose to it. And there is a feeling beyond just like this is nasty and bad or whatever. There are things being evoked, which is why like I love David Lynch. David Lynch ends up tapping into it, and they're very different. But there are some similarities in some places maybe where David Lynch is tapping into some like there's something like very real and unsettling about the way David Lynch will show darkness that really like speaks to me and moves me more than just stuff that's like gratuitous. Or again, there's something I've enjoyed a lot is the movie Midsommar, which there is a decent amount of gore in that, but it is all being very artfully done and evocative. And actually, Midsommar is actually kind of an interesting. I've not thought about Berserk and those as two interesting things. There's some interesting parallels there, but that is very gory. But it serves a purpose that again it makes it something I can really enjoy, even though there's a lot of like intensity and toughness behind it.
It's very intense. And I like the progression that he put into a lot of the monsters and a lot of the bad guys who, turn into monsters, where it's very frequently will start just in that unsettling territory where something's not right, something's weird, it's uncomfortable, it's creepy, and then it builds and it that helps with the tension. It helps with easing you into it. But it also like just it continually escalates into some of these monstrous designs that are just wildly creative and truly horrific on a scale that I haven't seen in many other things, and frankly, the ones that I have seen that are similar are very obviously inspired by what he was doing with this series.
Yeah. And I had read something recently that Kentaro Miura was inspired by both Elric and and Stormbringer for his setting and the whole kind of Black Swordsman thing, and also Book of the New Sun was actually a touch point for him.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, which is very interesting.
Talk about full circle.
Yeah, and
it's incredible.
I do think the way the details of the world are parsed out, where there's really very little given, and then little snippets here and there, which is also very Dark Souls.
Yeah.
Which you've talked about, and I did the thing you did, but then didn't play the game. Where like,
right.
but I was borrowing it.
Like I
got to
can't.
which is I was really mad, but I got to the one like down at whatever that first bad guy is, like 4 times, and then I was like, I can't beat this guy, and I was like, I'm too busy. But I guess there's a different way to go. I'd never figured out the different way to go. Either way, whatever.
You just have to beat him.
You do actually have to just beat that thing.
You do actually just have to win.
I think I have not played Dark Souls.
Oh, the original one? Okay.
I tried. A friend of mine let me borrow 2, and that I was not ready for it. And
sure.
I got to that point. I was like, no, fuck this. I'm not doing.
Supposedly, there's literally you're just supposed to go somewhere else.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things that those games try to teach you very early on. Is like there's when you start Elden Ring, there's a mini boss essentially right where you spawn.
Yeah,
and it teaches you like, hey. Sure, you can fight him.
Yeah.
But you're probably going to get your ass beat. So I would suggest finding a different way to go around it. And that's a kind of an important lesson to learn. It's like you don't have to fight everything. You're in a prison.
It does not feel like there's somewhere else to go. Obviously, there is. And I just didn't keep at it. If I had been 24 or 5, I probably would have kept playing. Right. But at this point, and the guy I borrowed it from was like kind of mad at me. I was like, I kept fighting this thing, and I'm just like, whatever. And then he was like, okay. He was like, okay, all right. And I was like, sorry.
But that is something I know. Obviously, the aesthetics of the From Software games are very much inspired by Berserk.
Yes.
And I have to assume that a lot of that storytelling is also very heavily inspired. Where there certainly is more exposition in Berserk than there is in the From Software games.
Sure. But
there is a fair amount of really having to kind of piece things together yourself. And I find that very interesting that maybe he was getting some of the inspiration for that from Gene Wolfe.
Well, and I think because while there's a lot of very, sort of on its face to exposition and adventuring, there's a lot of esoteric details and there's things where there's like, this is not really a spoiler, but there's a repeated eclipse that happens that is very significant. And then there's like, it happens every 240 years or something, which is also at the point in the story we've read which is everything that's available in the deluxe volumes. Is not all that
available
important
in English at this moment.
Yeah, actually, that's a great way to put it. Like there's a detail there that I think then you can actually like, if you think about it and link it up with other like sparse information that's given, you can kind of get a conception of some of the behind the scenes details of the world. But it's like nothing is like explained. It's never like, hey, this is what's going on and this is what's happening. It's just like, here are these little like snippets of details of what's going on, and we're just going to kind of leave it at that. But it feels like, this relates to another discussion. It feels like there are other things going on in the story we're not being told sometimes, even though what's very important to the characters is what we're getting and is the story.
Soul Calibur, there's another video game that's very obviously inspired by Berserk.
Absolutely.
The big swords.
Yeah, and Nightmare is like 100% a Berserk baddie. But then Siegfried's sword is like straight up the Dragon Slayer sword.
Yes, and yes, absolutely. No, and especially with that being a Capcom game. Isn't that a Capcom game?
No, Namco.
Namco, my bad.
Yeah.
I mean, it definitely it's absolutely doing that. And then interestingly though, Siegfried sort of becomes there's like an evil version which definitely sort of relates.
Berserk, Berserk armor, but if Guts kind of
was bad
into that fully.
Yes, absolutely.
Trying not to get into spoiler territory already.
Yeah.
One thing that I've kind of briefly touched on a little bit, but that definitely appealed to me. I come back to this continually, but one of my favorite tropes in fantasy is the found family, and that is all over Berserk. And watching Guts let his walls down enough to start accepting these people into his life as not just friends, but as a family. And I never thought that this was going to be my reaction reading these books, but it was genuinely one of the most touching things I think I've read, certainly in a very long time. But the family that he ends up building around himself is truly it's a beautiful part of the story, and it's a story that you wouldn't expect to have something like that, because it can be so oppressive and so violent and so dark, and the horrors are so horrific, and the big bad betrayal is one of the worst things I've ever read. That's one thing I will say. Let's talk a little bit about the how the first arcs of the book are structured, because I think it's, without getting into any sort of spoilers, I think we can still talk about it. And it's written in I'm not a huge fan of flashbacks. In fact, I most of the time hate flashbacks because they very frequently end up being just exposition in a different form, and very frequently feel very lazy to me. Again, the numbers I'm going to be bringing up are these Dark Horse editions. But at the very beginning of Berserk, the very beginning of the story, it's the same way in the anime as well. We start out in the present. We know that Guts has lost a hand. We know that he has this big-ass sword. We know he's now called the Black Swordsman. He's got this little elf creature that's following him around. He's really good at killing things. And then we find out that something really terrible has happened to him. And he's extremely mad, hates this character named Griffith. We find all of that out with no context, nothing at all. It's just the world. We're dropped right in the middle of the story. And then it pretty immediately cuts back several years in what you think is going to be a flashback. But what it really kind of is that beginning was almost a flash forward, and the story really starts from the beginning. And so you're working your way towards the present day story that you started out with the knowledge that something horrible is going to happen, where you're meeting characters that are not there anymore. And you know that they're not there because you've already read a present day or future at this point part of the story where something bad has happened and those characters aren't there. And so there's this incredible sense of dread that builds as you're reading this story because of how he structured the beginning of it. That is unlike anything that I've ever read before, I think. And it was all because of that amazing use and kind of twisting around of the flashback.
Well, yeah, you think you're gonna get a little flashback when it shows up, and I had the same feeling. I was annoyed at first, like, oh, it's here as a kid, and then it turns out, actually, really, we've been given a brief flash forward, and we've now picked up the story.
Yeah,
and we're going to continue up to that point, and then we'll like skip the point we've already read eventually, and then continue on.
It would be like watching Star Wars: A New Hope, the moment that Obi-Wan gets killed by Vader, and then starting over at the prequel. Like, literally, starting over at Episode 1, you're like,
it actually,
what? Like, you're dropped right into this thing. Like, all this stuff happens, and you're like, yes, I get to see what Luke does. I get to see his grandfather, his dad.
Yeah.
What?
There was this. I've not sat down and watched it, but you bringing up Star Wars actually it reminds me. There was a thing going around on the internet for a while. They were calling like the machete order for the Star Wars films, where you would start with A New Hope, and then you would watch Empire Strikes Back, and you would get the revelation that Vader is Luke's father, and then immediately go back to the prequels.
Interesting.
And start.
I see him. Oh, this is my daddy when he was a boy.
So then you're getting, as we all do, but I mean, unless you're a kid, I guess, who's starting with Episode 1 and you don't know where Anakin's story is going to go, but you are getting that prequel of seeing this little kid and this teenager up through, Episode 3, and Anakin turning into Darth Vader. You're getting all of that before going into Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
And I always thought that was kind of an interesting way to watch those stories, and it is kind of similar.
It felt like that to me.
Yeah.
Which was jarring because it's not anything I don't think any of us had ever experienced before this.
Yeah, I can't think of anything that is a parallel that I've actually watched or read.
Like, we get the flashback, but not the flash forward start. Like, what?
Yeah.
Which is intriguing. Like, the pace of this all of Berserk has been like wacky, but in the best way.
But it lent itself to this amazing thing where like you'd get lost in this new story of Guts and these friends that he's making and this life that he's a part of, and you'd kind of forget that something terrible is on its way.
Yeah, the sense of loss is very felt.
Yeah, and then you'd remember like, oh shit, all these characters that I'm growing to love, like something is going to happen.
But then you hope like something doesn't, and you like kind of think maybe something doesn't. But
and the interesting thing is, and again, we're gonna staying relatively free of spoilers, is you think, because Guts is this ruthless. He says, don't touch me to people all the time. He says, don't, talk to me. He doesn't want to make friends with anyone. He's very distant with Puck, the little elf we meet very early on. And he's brutal and completely cold. Well, when we flash back, we find out that he had a very hard childhood. You find out very quickly he's gone through numerous levels of different trauma as a very young boy. And you think, this is the explanation for why Guts is the way he is. And obviously it's a part of it. Mm-hmm. But then like a
16th.
Yes. But then actually the rest of that arc, which my assumption in the way flashbacks go is you're going to get pulled back out of that to be like, okay, this is why he is the way he is. And then we're going to continue on with our story. Mm-hmm. Well, then young Guts just continues on. And actually in that young arc, then there is the undoing of most of that very young trauma. Right. And Guts finding a family. And then actually you find out that it's the losing of that family that is why he is the way he is. And not because of the way he was treated as a boy.
Well, it's very the only thing I would add to that,
I felt like it was a rope-a-dope.
Right. The only thing I would add to that too is that the big betrayal that comes at the end of this first arc mirrors a lot of that trauma that he already went through as a child.
Yeah, for sure.
And so it reopens every single one of those wounds, like times. Oh yes, times 1,000.
But I will say, I don't know. What happens later is so bad that it's worse because of what he went through as a kid. Yes. But I don't know if it would make much of a difference if we're being.
Well, I think it just amplifies a lot of things.
Sure, and I guess they talk about the childhood being foundational and stuff.
A lot of old traumas that maybe he could have moved past.
Sure,
had this not happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so then watching him rebuild again from that even greater trauma that is, exponentially worse because of everything else gone before it. And man, oh man, speaking of knowing that this big thing is coming, and it's what, book 3 or 4 that it all
6.
6 is when the eclipse happens.
Yes.
So you go through 6 of these books, these size books, knowing that this thing is coming. And just to harp back again on what an absolute genius Kentaro Miura was and what a true artist and masterful storyteller. What a easy fumble that would be.
Oh, sure.
To set up for this very long story. What would be a full-length story for most other mediums, most other stories. To set up this whole time this horrible thing that is going to happen, this apocalyptically evil, traumatic event. That would be the easiest thing in the world to not deliver on.
Yep.
And yet, reading it was so much worse than what I imagined it could be. So he not only stuck the landing, but he gets a 10 out of 10 from the German judge on it. It's so horrible, and it's presented so evilly and drawn so well, which is a weird thing to say, but it's just expertly handled and expertly told from a storytelling perspective. It's a hard thing to tip your hat to because it is so bad. But at the same time, from a storytelling perspective, it's a masterful work that he stuck that landing and exceeded my expectations for what was going to happen.
Yeah, and then it's obviously we've got the story we've got, but then the way the story unfolds after that too was both continually satisfying and surprising.
Yes.
Which I feel like a lot of stories struggle to be one or the other.
Yes.
But it reminds me of it's very different than Breaking Bad, obviously, but Breaking Bad to me is the pinnacle of fiction that what came before it informs what happens next. And especially, at least for a TV show where every character to beat is weighed, and what happened in the last episode informs the next episode, and there's no just resetting of things and forgetting that you get a show I love the show Lost, but you'll get the one episode they're pointing guns at each other and they're I'm going to kill you, and they vaguely make up at the end, and then they're buddies in the next episode. Again, I really like Lost, but it's do you really go from pointing guns at each other to moving on? Again, this isn't about that. But my point is, Berserk is pretty painstaking in its dedication to thoughtful storytelling, where we're not going to take any shortcuts. While there are mythic and supernatural and fantastical things going on, we're getting from point A to point B in a way that makes sense. The Lord of the Rings is another one that does this really well. We're we're going to do it in a journey, and the point is for it to be believable. There's
not a whole lot of Deus Ex Machina necessarily. No. It's
there's a point where they have to get a boat, and then there's several volumes of how they get a boat.
Yes.
And it's a slower volume. While that happens, it's still very enjoyable.
Yeah.
But he's not going to just magic them a boat, And again, you could probably yada yada it, but he's very dedicated to nope, this has to happen naturally and practically.
Yeah, well, and it's not even just not magicking. It's also not oh, well, I've got a boat. You could pay me 10 gold and you can have my boat. I'll take you wherever you need to go.
And you can do that in storytelling, and it makes sense and it'd be fine. But actually, he finds a way to blend it into the story very naturally, and the story develop in a way that actually makes sense. And it's very, very powerful and evocative, and adds to the reality of such a fantastical world, which I think, unless you're writing something in a very fairy tale style, you have to have that real that reality just adds a ton of weight to what he's doing.
Well, and speaking of kind of a reality to a fantasy thing, I don't know why Berserk is not included in conversations about grimdark fantasy, but it's very grimdark. And it starts, in '89. That's really when the grimdark movement is getting launched because of the Black Company in the early '80s, and then, Song of Ice and Fire is about to get started. That departure into a darker, more realistic, gray moral compass fantasy, is starting to emerge, and Berserk slots right in there. I think.
Sure, yeah. Although one thing I will say is I don't think Berserk has gray morals.
I don't think it does either. I think that's probably where but I would also argue that I think that the gray morals is maybe an oversold part of Grimdark.
That's fair.
Because you use the Black Company as an example. Definitely morally gray. They're not good guys, but they still, by the end of the arc of those first 3 books, are the good guys.
Yeah.
And there is good and evil. It's just not as clear cut all the time.
Well,
and fewer examples of one extreme or the other.
Well, and I do think, I guess there is also a difference there's morally gray characters, and then there's also books where the ethics of the book are morally gray, and those are actually very different things.
True. Yes.
A book can be well, what's bad and what's good? Do we even know? And that's the ethics of the book, and we're going to ponder that. There's also books where it's this character has very conflicted emotions, and their actions display a range of outcomes, but good is good and bad is bad. And I think Berserk falls into that category.
Right. I think the more do than let on. I think it's a bit of a stereotype in the grimdark universe that it's all gray.
That's fair.
Because you look at Shed in Black Company, objectively bad dude.
Yes.
But also
redeems
himself. Yeah, I know, it's very clear. And I actually think, and I maybe shouldn't say this as someone who's not read a Song of that are out, A Song of Ice and Fire, but I actually think Game of Thrones gets a bad rap as a morally gray universe, as far from a top-down perspective to some degree of the books, because I think the show was more morally gray than probably the books were.
Yeah,
sort
of. It's been a long time.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that all of it makes sense based on motivations of characters, because people are faithful to the people that are going to benefit them in all of those. And I think the same applies to Berserk. I think the thing that strikes me the most about it is that it's probably the bleakest thing I've ever read, in terms of the hope that's peppered into the story is literally 1 grain.
Yeah.
One grain.
But it really
hope.
is like a shining beacon, but it's so tiny.
No, that's what I'm saying. It's not even overpowering. It's like a beacon. I wouldn't even say beacon. I would say a crack in the ceiling. The hope that is in this story is so small that it only sort of amplifies when you get to the volume 12.
Yeah.
And there's only 13 out.
Yeah.
So it's the whole through story. There is almost no hope, and everything that looks hopeful kind of gets just shit on every time in the story. And then whenever you feel like hope is coming, you're expecting it to not work because of how it's told and what Guts' experiences have been.
I think that's one of the powerful parts of this story, though, is that it is it's beyond a slim sliver of hope.
But any hope at all will keep the story going.
Yes, but watching their journey as they cling to that one tiny little sliver of hope.
Well, and
it's almost so small I can't even articulate what. Even in spoiler, I wouldn't I don't even know what I would say the hope is. Like,
yeah,
he's really good at swords.
No, I mean, I know what you mean. When it's like the family and the community he develops. But
that doesn't come for
think,
so long.
No. It takes a very long time, and there's lots of missteps along the way.
And even that doesn't feel promising when it starts. It doesn't.
You're so nervous.
Every time we read, we're like, it's probably gonna end.
We're trained to it at that point.
And maybe you feel differently, but I felt like if you had like if you had a blackout curtain pulled really tight and you put a bonfire on the other side of it, the hope in Berserk is like you're staring at that curtain and then like you poke a hole. So there's like this huge blazing heat and light on the other side, and then it like that. Like there's one little hole, but it's like, and you're like, wow, there's like a lot.
There's something back there.
There's like a lot there, but you're worried it's just gonna go away or not become more. But then as the story goes, like more little ones come, and again, you're still worried the whole entire time that this is all gonna get covered up and ruined. But it's like that's what I mean. It's like it's a pinprick, but that pinprick is like just like it's like shooting out.
Yeah,
you know?
it just keeps you going, right?
Yes,
especially it kept me turning the pages like crazy.
Yes. Especially when Shirky shows up. Spoiler alert. I mean, don't Google the name Shirky.
That
you know how to spell it.
Good luck. I honestly would say the same because that character's presence opens up a hole like that to where like I do think
that's the turning. That's the first turning point.
That's what I was alluding to without trying to be spoilery, I guess. Yeah. But that is the opening that you're like. So you're saying there's a chance.
Well, and again, if we want to should we revisit this conversation maybe in chunks?
I think so. I think it would be fun to do.
I think this is kind of a good place to maybe wrap this up a little bit. But.
Yeah. I think
when we do this, it does thumbs up on the screen.
Oh.
Hey, look at that. That's a new one.
Shining beacons.
The beacons are lit.
The beacons are lit. So yeah, we're gonna come back and we're gonna do some more spoilery, in-depth discussions where we'll go arc by arc.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is, every bit of hype that you've ever heard about Berserk is accurate.
Very true.
If not undersold.
I would say undersold, to be honest.
I am not exaggerating at all when I say this is not only is this literature. This is one of the best pieces of fantasy literature I've ever read. It transcends the medium. You will be seeing it for sure when we revisit our top 10 lists at the end of the year, for me at least. And I cannot recommend it highly enough. If you're a fan of fantasy, if you're a fan of comic books or manga, just be forewarned. All the trigger warnings. It's rough to read sometimes. The story is exquisite. And it means the absolute world to me. And I'm heartbroken that we lost Kentaro Miura.
Before he finished.
And I am excited to read how his work is being continued and how his legacy is being carried forth.
I am as well. And very excited to finish this journey. And boy, did he leave on an interesting note.
Yeah. I was shook for a couple of days.
I still don't really know
I've
how
never
I feel
wanted
about
to
it.
channel the dead, but like for this one, it's like if
Yeah.
someone was gonna bite the bullet and channel the dead, like it would be worth it for this one. Like,
Does anyone have the number for the Witch of Endor?
Yeah, there you go.
Like if we're gonna get her up for anything, like
this would be it.
This would be it. Which is kind of a goofy thing.
Well,
or
I mean,
like
he's
in Broken
done-
Sword,
he's-
when they're like, "What are you doing?"
listen, I read this anime
Wicked the Dead.
and it's not fully finished, but the guy who wrote it,
you guys will all thank us once this is finished.
I might sacrifice my soul, but we get to finish the story.
Yeah.
Amazing.
All right, yeah. Well, read Berserk.
Yes.
It
Go
will,
crazy.
It will
Go
stick
Berserk.
with you. Go Berserk. It's phenomenal. So, all right. This has been another episode of Under Towers. I'm Steven.
I'm Daniel.
I'm Sam.
Follow us on all of the social media bullshits.
Thumbs up.
Listen to Hole Dweller. He does our music.
And yes.
Listen to Horsebread.
Yes.
There we go. Yeah. We love y'all. Namaria. We'll see you next time.